Thank you so much for coming, and I'm so excited to say this evening we are joined by Judith Kerr. Judith's works include The Tiger Who Came to Tea, the infamous Mogg series, as well as novels for slightly older children, such as the semi-autobiographical When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit. We've got a book sale going on outside. You can buy Mr. Cleghorn's Seal, which is her latest illustrated novel. So if we could please have a round of applause for Judith Kerr. Thank you so much for coming, Judith. Are you all right? Let's move the water. Okay. So my first question to you, Judith, is why does Mogg die at the end of the Mogg series? Why did you choose to kill Mogg?
Well, there are several reasons. One was that my husband and I were getting on for 80, and I was thinking quite a bit about death. The other was perhaps almost more pressing, which was that I really got terribly sick of drawing those stripes on her. I think I thought I'd done enough, you know, and I thought about people dying, and you remember them, and you tend, I find, I just remember the funny things they did. And I try to imagine, well, I had this strange dream, which was about my own death and my own funeral, which was dreadful. It's very all dark and cold, and only my children were there. And anyway, finally it was all over. And in my dream, one of them said to the other, "What shall we do now?" And the other one said, "Let's go to McDonald's." And in my dream, ever the Yiddische Mama, I thought, absolutely typical. They've hardly got me underground, and they're going to eat junk food. And I think that's probably how, if they're up there watching us, how they feel. What are they doing now? You know, I mean,
Yes.
Ridiculous.
And I know that Mogg was based on your family cat, wasn't he? Could you please tell us a little about Mogg?
Yes, I'd always wanted a cat all my childhood, and I could never have one because, you know, being refugees, we were all over the place. And I always, my husband was very good on cats. He'd always had cats, and he loved them too. So you can't really have a cat in a flat, but when we got a house with a small garden, first thing we did was get a cat, and we got this cat called Mogg. And she was so peculiar. I mean, they are weird. Cats are weird. That I thought I would do a book about all the things she used to do, all these weird things of hanging her tail down in front of the telly, so we'd stop watching and give her supper. And yes, well then I realized, of course, that that's not enough for a story, and that something would have to happen. And my husband was a scriptwriter. He knew about all these things. And so I said to him, of course, something will have to happen in this story. And he was deep in work, and so he just said, "Oh, let her catch a burglar." So that's what I did. And so that's what the book was, really. All the things this mad cat did, and then she caught a burglar by mistake, as they do.
And now you have quite a few cats, don't you? How many was it that you said you had earlier? That you've had over your lifetime.
Sorry,
how many cats have you had over your lifetime? I know we were talking
I'm
about
on
that
number
earlier.
9.
Number 9, cat number 9.
Because the children, we got Mogg when they were very small, and they wanted kittens, and the kittens grew into cats and had more kittens, and it goes on rather. Once you start, there's no stopping.
And talking about sort of bigger cats, how did you come up, what was the inspiration for the tiger who came to tea?
Well, that was before I'd ever thought of doing any picture books at all. It was when I'd always worked, but I always thought I'd look after the children myself. And when my daughter was 2, going on 3, I used to make up bedtime stories for her. And children's picture books weren't very good at that time. They were rather sort of solemn and deliberately written in words that the child wouldn't understand. And then it said, this will increase your child's vocabulary. It only meant you had to translate it every time. And so I used to make up this story for her about a tiger coming to tea, because my husband was out a lot at that time filming, and it was very boring because normally he worked at home. And we both longed for somebody to come and visit us. And we'd been to the zoo, and we both thought the tigers were absolutely terrific and very beautiful. And so I thought I'd make up this story about a tiger coming to tea. And I put in all the things she liked, like going out in the dark. She was crazy about going out in the dark. And it was originally called Tacy and the Tiger. Her name is Tacy. And it was about her and this tiger. And then much, much later, when both she and her brother, who was born later, were at school all day and stayed to lunch, which is the first moment when you actually have time to work if you're looking after small children, because they're out of the house from 9 till 3. And I couldn't think what to do then, and I thought, well, I would try to do a picture book of this story that I told her. And it all worked out, they published it and everything.
And I know, I know a lot of people, when they read The Tiger Who Came to Tea, have read sort of the tiger as being emblematic of Hitler, because of course you grew up in sort of Nazi Germany. Can you understand why people see it that way and why they read it that way?
I can never understand why people analyze anything. I don't know. I think I think because well, they're conscious of the fact that I escaped from Hitler, but I didn't think I was escaping from Hitler. I was 9 years old, and I didn't really particularly understand what was going on.
Yeah.
And I'd never seen the Gestapo. I've been very lucky. I don't remember ever seeing a Nazi, so it certainly wouldn't influence my tiger. But I don't know, maybe just because people know I've had this past,
Yes.
they try to explain even very simple things by it.
Well, I do sympathise with you. I'm always trying to tell my literature supervisor that we shouldn't analyse things so deeply, but anyway. And talking sort of your life in Germany, could you please explain the title behind When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit?
Sorry?
Could you please explain the title behind When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit?
Oh, well, that's very easy. My husband thought of it because, and at the time, nobody really really thought that was a good title. They thought it was a bit odd. But nowadays, people think it's really rather good. I always thought it was rather good. Well,
yes, I agree. I definitely agree.
The reason for it was quite simply that I had this pink rabbit, which I used to take to bed with me, and it was sort of not long after Christmas, and I'd been given this woolly dog for Christmas, which was new, and we could only take one toy. And so I looked at both these things, and I thought, well, I haven't really had the use of the woolly dog. I'll take the woolly dog, which was a grave mistake, because he was very boring, and I missed my pink rabbit. And of course, Hitler, everything we had was confiscated, so presumably he was enjoying Pink Rabbit.
I have, well, on that point, I have a quote here from the novel, When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit. I'd just like to read it out to everybody. So, I always knew that we should have bought the games compendium, said Max. Hitler was probably playing snakes and ladders with it this very minute. And snuggling my pink rabbit, said Anna. So based on that quote, obviously this is showing sort of a child's naivety as to what was going on. How much realistically as a child were you able to understand of the situation in Germany?
Well, that, I think, even then, it was a joke. I didn't really think he would be snuggling my pink rabbit.
Of course.
He may have been, we don't know. At that point, we were beginning to understand what was happening, my brother and I. Well, he understood a bit more. I mean, he was older than I, and more sort of noticing, I think. I think my parents were admirable. They managed to keep a lot of it from us. We knew we didn't have much money, or very little money, but we hadn't had that much money before as a family. I mean, we weren't terribly rich. We saw the whole thing of going to Switzerland and then Paris and then coming here as an adventure. They made it look like an adventure. They made it feel like an adventure, and it was an adventure. I mean, both my brother and I always agreed that the childhood we had was infinitely better and more interesting than if nothing had happened and Hitler had never happened and we just stayed on in Berlin. It was lovely. Not for my parents, but
Well, because obviously as well, sort of Nazism is a very difficult subject, especially for a young child. How did you balance what is such a hard subject with children's literature?
Well, I wasn't particularly trying to write about the Nazis. In fact, I wasn't at all. I wanted to tell my children about what my childhood had been like, which is what parents always want to do, and children don't necessarily want to hear it, but one does do it. And I was talking to my husband about this, and he said, but you can't just talk. You can't just write about how you went to Switzerland and you went to a Swiss school, and then you went to Paris, and then you came to England. Hitler has got to be on the first page. It hadn't really occurred to me, but I got him on the second page. Of course, it was what was behind it all, but because my parents were so protective, I suppose, I hadn't thought of it in those terms, even though, of course, I was very conscious of it at the time.
Yes.
The Nazis put a price on my father's head, even though he was outside Germany. And they did kidnap people and bring them back. I mean, they really hated him. And I did know that. I heard about that, which was quite frightening. But most of the time, it was just, you come to a country, Paris, France, and you can't understand a word anybody's saying. And then after a year or 18 months, this has become your language. You can think in this language, and And then if you know that's possible, you know, it gives you a terrific boost. You know, you think, I didn't think I could do that, and I've done it. It's a great help.
And how did you find sort of learning French and English? Was one more difficult than the other to pick up?
French was more difficult because it's so totally different from German. I loved it because of the brevity of it. After the long German sentences,
Yes, I know.
this incredible clarity. English, if you can speak, well, you must know all this, studying languages. If you can speak French and German, English, which is based on both languages, is not so difficult. Besides, by that time we knew it was possible, and I'd already learned a little English before we came here. So it wasn't
Too tricky.
too difficult. No.
And could you perhaps?
Though I think
yes.
English is a funny language. It's very easy to learn enough to get around.
Yes.
But it's such a wonderfully rich language. If you want really to use it well, is quite a long process.
And could you perhaps tell us a little bit more about your sort of emigration from Germany over the border into Switzerland, and then eventually to London, how you found that?
What, going from place to place?
Yes, sort of your gradual emigration to London.
Well, you sort of got used to it and almost expected it. When we were living here, we used to go back to France a lot. And I got used to being at home in several countries. And I remember when the war broke out, thinking, well, are we going to be stuck in one place? Because, of course, you couldn't travel. You couldn't go to France anymore. It seemed rather appalling, briefly, because I suppose we were Europeans, which is becoming rather a difficult thing nowadays.
Yes. And do you remember more specifically sort of actually leaving your house and having to go and cross the border? Because presumably that must have been quite scary.
Yes, well, it wasn't scary enough because I didn't really understand quite what was going on. In fact, my father had already left in a great rush because he'd been rung up by somebody who told him that they were about to take away his passport, and this was even before Hitler came to power. And he left immediately, and then my mother and my brother and I were going to meet him in Zurich. And he had decided wisely that we shouldn't travel on one of the big express trains from Berlin to Zurich because people might be watching for us, because he thought that if the Nazis knew we were leaving, they would try and hang on to us to get him back, which seems extraordinary now, but it's what they did to other people. And so we took a train to Stuttgart and spent the night there, and then crossed over to Zurich by a very early train, about 5 o'clock in the morning. We took this little train that stopped everywhere, but did go across the frontier. And my mother had told us, when we get to the frontier and the man comes to check our passports, don't say a word, not a word. And we said, okay, yes, we wouldn't. And so when when the passport inspector came, I didn't say anything, but as he was going out, I began to say, "There you see, nothing's happened." He wasn't a very intelligent child. And my mother gave me a terrible look, so I stopped after "there you see," and we were all right. But it wasn't very clever. But I wasn't really frightened because I didn't really... My brother sort of wound me up over it and said, "They'll take away your passport," or something. So I was very pleased to tell him that he'd been wrong.
Sibling rivalry.
Yes.
And could you perhaps tell us a bit more about your father? You mentioned him briefly, but I know that he was Germany's foremost theatre critic, and he was also very vocally sort of against the Nazis.
Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit more about the difficulties that he faced sort of with Hitler's rise to power?
In Germany, when we were in Berlin, well, again, I didn't know any of this at the time. My mother told me much later, but the Nazis had this paper called Der Stürmer, and in 1932, long before Hitler even became Chancellor, they printed a sort of death list in Der Stürmer, and they said, "These are the people whom we will stand up against the wall and shoot when we come to power." And my dad was number 2 on the list.
Goodness.
But they didn't tell me that reasonably enough, so I had no idea. He used to write a regular column in the big Berlin paper, and he was really a drama critic, but he wrote all sorts of other stuff as well, travel and some very good verse. So he used to write about Hitler. He foresaw it early on, and he used to make fun of him, which of course is the worst thing you can do. They really hated him, and he used to do a broadcast once a week, and of course there was no recording. It was just radio, and it was live, which meant that every Thursday, I think it was, he would have to go from our house to the studios to do his broadcast and probably lambaste Hitler or make fun of him or whatever it was. And then he'd have to come back through the Berlin streets, which were already quite dangerous. This was in 1932, and people were being killed in the streets, and police didn't do very much. And so the broadcasting company used to send a car with an armed bodyguard to pick him up and bring him back again. And he himself thought it was so dangerous that he once wrote a farewell note to my mother in case he never came back. But we had no idea of this. We just thought the car was rather impressive. I mean, we didn't have a car, and this car came to pick my father up. It was all rather good, we thought. We didn't know.
And I know, Judith, that when your father returned to Germany, that very sadly he suffered a stroke, and that with the help of your mother, took his own life.
Yes.
How did you cope with that decision at the time, and how do you feel about it, looking back on it now?
Oh, well, he was 100% right. I wished I could have said goodbye to him, but suicide at that time was a crime. If you tried to kill yourself and you made a mess of it, you were put to jail, which couldn't have cheered people up very much if they were already depressed enough to try to commit suicide. So it had to be very secret. And if we'd all been there, my brother and me, it would have looked rather suspicious. So my mother was absolutely right in what she did. I've had no trouble coping with the fact that he committed suicide. He was 100% right. But of course I missed him dreadfully. One funny thing was everybody, well, my mother and a journalist in Hamburg where this happened, who helped her, a Scottish journalist who helped her get the pills for my father, they all told him, now whatever you do, you mustn't leave any notes, because he was supposed to have died of natural causes. And in fact, this is what everyone assumed. But this journalist, who was a clever chap, he was thinking about it, and he thought on the night when my father was going to take the pills, this man's a writer, he's going to leave notes anyway. And so he went to the hospital, I think about 4:30 in the morning, or 5 o'clock, and went, there was nobody about, and went to my father's bed, and my father was dead, and the bed was covered in notes, and he gathered them all up, and we, you know, they were addressed to us and my mother, and a record of what was happening. The last words he wrote were, "I feel that I am dying." So that's what writers are like.
And do you find yourself sort of later in life now thinking much more about everything that's happened in your past?
Yes, I think this is something seems to happen to. You tend to remember your childhood. You go back to the past. I think, you know, there's not so much to distract you. You're not so much in the present. Well, I work, of course, but you're not so busy, I think, and you do think back. And, you know, think how incredibly lucky one's been. You know, we got to Zurich. I think the elections which brought Hitler to power were on the 5th of March. We got to Zurich on the 4th of March. And at 8 o'clock in the morning on the 6th of March, immediately after the elections, we heard that 2 Nazis had come to our house to demand all our passports. So all these 90 plus years of my life are made possible by that decision, my parents at that time. By 48 hours, I made it by 48 hours, and I've had all this
Astounding.
long, long life since, this long, happy life. I'm terribly lucky.
And on the note of your family, I just want to ask you a question about your late husband, Tom, who I know was also a writer. He was very famous for the Quartermass series.
Yes, that's right.
What was it like having 2 writers in the house? Was there a sense of rivalry? Did you inspire each other?
We weren't 2 writers. We were a writer and a drawer. And the only novels I ever wrote were about my family, and he was hugely encouraging about it. He thought, in fact, Pink Rabbit, I was about to give up after 3 months because it was so difficult and so slow. And he read it, which was very difficult because it was all written in pencil and crossed out, and I'd actually gone through the paper sometimes And he said, no, this is all right, you must finish it, you must go on doing it. And he gave me lots of very good advice. I don't think I would ever have written it if I hadn't been married to him, because if you live with a writer, you do learn an awful lot. You can't help picking it up. And he was particularly good at construction, which is the basis of the whole thing. And so I learned quite a lot about that.
So do you consider yourself to be more an illustrator than a writer?
Oh, yes. Yes. I only write... I like drawing, really. I mean, I do like writing my own picture books, because one thing, it gives you a chance to... you don't write about things that you hate to draw. I mean, this is very important. I can't draw cars, for instance. I try to avoid them.
You just leave them out.
It's no. I've always drawn, but I'm the daughter of a writer, and the wife of a writer. And actually, the mother of a very good writer who's won the Whitbread, Matthew Neal.
Yes.
So one's surrounded by it, it sort of comes off on one.
And didn't your daughter do something for the Harry Potter series as well?
She made
very talented
she
family.
made a rat and an owl, but. I think the owl was never needed, because the real owls were so clever that they could do everything. Yes, she used to do special effects, or she used to do the fur and the face, I think, and things like that.
Can you remember what sort of things you enjoyed drawing as a child, as I know that in your childhood you drew all the time?
Well, it's much the same as now. I like drawing people. And in movement, and I don't think I was so good at animals. I liked drawing animals later, but I just like drawing people, and I still do. Everything else is a bit of an effort. I mean, houses and trees and furniture, cars, all dreadful. People and animals are all right, yes.
I remember watching one of your interviews where you went back to see your old house in Berlin, and you talked about how you sacrificed one of your drawings to God. Would you like to tell that story?
Well, it was quite funny, because we were Jews, but not religious Jews at all. And my father had been brought up in the Jewish faith and thought it was very beautiful. But when he was about 20, he decided he didn't believe in God. So he still liked all the ethics and passed some of them on to us, but not God. And so... Yes, well, I got to believe in God very briefly, because I used to, just because I knew my parents didn't believe in it, and at that time just about everybody else did. I thought about it a lot. And I remember one day at breakfast, we used to have that sort of black bread, but there was always one white roll per person for breakfast. And I thinking about God, and I thought, all right, well, I'll clear this once and for all. And I said, all right, God, if you exist, let them give me a second white roll, which I knew to be impossible. And somebody must have not eaten theirs, and they gave it to me. And so I was stuck with God after that. For quite a while, but then it wore off, I think. You were asking me something else about...
You sacrificed one of your paintings.
Oh, yes, well, that was during the sort of God bit. I thought I'd done rather a good drawing, and I thought, well, perhaps I should sacrifice it to God. And I thought, well, I should tear it up. And then I looked at it, and I thought it'd be a pity, really. And so I thought, all right, well, I closed my eyes, and I threw it in the air, and I said, here you are, God, that's for you. And I waited quite a long time, but he didn't take it. So I thought, well, I might as well keep it, you know.
Judith, what a wonderful story. Thank you so much. I'd just like to ask if there are any questions from the audience at all for Judith. Yes, at the front. Would you mind waiting for a microphone, please?
Okay. So clearly you dealt with the whole moving around to different countries really well after you left Germany because you were so young and, as you said, you thought it was an adventure. How did your parents deal with it? Because I remember I read the books about when Hitler stole Pink Rabbit, and I remember you saying that they weren't quite as adventurous or naive, I guess, about it as you were.
It was very different for them. They kept it from us. Well, once we got to England, I was a bit older, and it was even harder for them here because my father couldn't really speak the language. And then I began to realize how very hard it was for them. But I was horrified very recently because somebody in Germany has written a biography of my father, which is just about coming out now, or did come out. And this woman did a lot of research and found a lot of letters which are in an archive in Berlin. And I had never seen some of these letters. And letters my father wrote soon after we left Berlin, a few weeks afterwards, because from the moment Hitler came to power, he was co-editor of the newspaper he worked on, and he published a lot of books which sold well. And he was owed quite a lot of money by his publisher and the newspaper. And from the moment Hitler came to power, this was cut off. So we had no money. And I've seen copies of the letters he wrote to anybody he knew trying to get work, saying, well, I made things worse by getting terribly ill, and we were stuck in a hotel in Switzerland, and they were having to try to pay the doctor and try to pay the hotel bill, and they had no money. And these shattering letters from my father to the editor of the paper, who was a decent man, but of course weren't allowed to get any money to him, sort of saying, I know you have children, you wouldn't want us to be thrown out into the street. I don't know how they managed in the end, and I only found this out a few years ago, before all our possessions were confiscated. He must have somehow got word to a friend in Berlin who went to the store where all our furniture was stored and extracted a box of books. They were all first editions, I think, and signed editions from other writers sent to my father. And they were sold, and somehow he must have got the money to my father. I know this only because a few years ago I was rung up by a German newspaper, and they said, what are you going to do with those books? And I said, what books? And apparently this lot of books had been found in some library and marked as having been sold by A. Kerr, my father's name, in Switzerland. And the Germans, who are very good about restitution, have been very, very good and conscientious, found these books, and so they got on to me and said they were sold far below their real worth, and would you like them back? And they've gone into my father's archive in Berlin. But that's the first I knew about how they managed at that time. They just tried to cope. They did I mean, I say they did have a bad time. They did have a bad time, but when you compare it with what happened to the people who didn't get out, nothing happened to us. We were fine. So it was just a very, very difficult time.
Right. Anyone else with a question? Yes, at the back in the grey jumper.
Could I just ask, how important is your European sort of identity to you, and how has it changed over the recent events?
So how important is your European identity to you, and how much about you thinking about your identity now has changed?
My European...
Yes. So the question sort of, do you consider yourself
European identity?
Yeah.
Well, like all refugees, I'm more English than the English, is what they say. I'm hugely grateful to this country. I always will be. They saved my life, and not only that, but helped my brother and me in every possible way with scholarships and endless kindness. But of course, I am very conscious that I wasn't born here. I came here. I was nearly 13 when I came. That's quite old, really. So I feel I belong here, and but I have all that. It's part of my life, my past.
And how initially then, so when you moved to England, did you have a culture shock, as it were? How did you find the sort of transition to English culture?
Well, the food was absolutely terrible. After Paris, you know, because my mother learned to cook in Paris, yes. And it was no, it was. I liked it. It was. One didn't have a great sense of permanence at that time. You sort of thought, well, right now, see what it's like here. And I just found it very interesting. I loved the language. I didn't really feel I belonged until the war. Before that, I first did lessons with some American children who were having lessons at home for some reason, and I loved them. But then, out of great kindness, because we were living in a hotel which wasn't, a very sort of shabby hotel, which wasn't really much fun for a child, I suppose, some very kind people got together to send me to a girls' boarding school, which was pretty awful. It was incredibly snobbish. There was this time we'd had a sort of housekeeper in Berlin who spoke a little English and tried to teach my brother and me a little English. And I must have said something about that. And these girls came up to me and they said, did your nanny have a Cockney accent? Well, you know, we never had a nanny. She was just a sort of housekeeper. And I said, I don't know. And they said, well, because we've all been discussing it, and we've all decided that your vowels aren't pure. It was like that. I didn't like that. I hated it. Well, it was all right in the end. I made friends in the end. I made a good friend who was actually Jeremy Thorpe's sister, Lavinia. She was lovely, very, very bright. And we edited a school magazine, I mean a sort of rebel school magazine together, which was quite fun. But it didn't exactly make me enamored of England. That came once during the war, when we were in London right through the Blitz, and people were incredible, incredibly kind and tolerant. My parents both had German accents, and people were being killed every night by bombs, and nobody ever said an unkind word to them. They had this marvelous thing. They had these categories for foreigners who were called aliens, which is rather sort of sinister nowadays. And there were enemy aliens, that was the Germans and the Italians, and later the Japanese. And then there were friendly aliens, and that was the French and the Poles and anybody else I can't think of. And then there were people like my family, and we were Germans, but we were quite clearly anti-Hitler, because they knew about my father. So they made this special category which was called Friendly Enemy Aliens. I respect that. And we were treated very, very good. People were very, very good, very, very good to us. I remember once the Blitz was very bad, and he had some friends in the country who'd invited me for a rest, get some sleep. And friendly enemy aliens had to report to the police if they were going to stay overnight more than 5 miles away, because, you had to know where they were. And the raids were very, very bad, and my mother wanted me to go and get out of it for a few nights. And I didn't want to go because, although I was very frightened, because all communications broke down with the air raids. The telephone lines were cut. It means you had no sort of contact with anybody, and I was so frightened that I might find myself in the country and my parents might be killed in an air raid, and I wouldn't even know about it. Nobody would be able to tell me. And so we were at the police station, because my mother wanted me to go and to report and say I was going to the country. And I was arguing with her, and there was a policeman listening to us, and he came up to us and he said, listen to me, you go to the country, and police telephones are always reconnected immediately. And you give me your telephone number in the country, and I will keep an eye on your parents, and I promise you if anything happens to them, I will ring you up. Which was incredible.
It's so lovely.
And, you know, we were the enemy, technically. Yeah, I think that's when I became a Brit.
Does anybody else have a question for Judith? Anybody? Oh, well, that's fortunate because I had another question I'd like to ask you, Judith. Have you been to see the theatrical production of The Tiger Who Came to Tea? And how did you find it?
Oh, well, of course. I mean, I was much involved in it. David Wood did this brilliantly. We talked about it before he wrote it, and I went to an early rehearsal when the tiger hadn't even got his suit yet, and he was being a tiger in you know, sort of trousers and a shirt, and I was rather sad actually when he got his suit and you could no longer see his face, because he was making such sort of wonderful expressions as what the tiger was thinking at that moment. No, it's brilliant. It's wonderful, and apparently they're very keen on it in China, which is
Really?
they do it in China and they love it in English, but I think with Chinese subtitles. And I mean, it's a brilliant thing. I never thought. I mean, this is just something I made up for my daughter, and for it to be played by real actors in China is very weird.
I think you're too modest, Judith. It's a wonderful story.
Well, I don't know. I put in everything she liked, you see, and I suppose she was typical 2-year-old, and so that's why people like it, why other children liked it. Must have been.
So unless we have any further questions from the... Oh, we do. James, at the front, please, if we could have a microphone.
I was very excited last Christmas when Mog became the face of the Sainsbury's Christmas advert.
Yeah.
I was wondering how it felt to have Mog used in an advertising campaign, and particularly how it felt as an illustrator for Mog to have been made using computer-generated imagery.
Well, I thought they were absolutely brilliant. My main part in it really was that I had to do the book very quickly, and it wasn't my story. It was the Sainsbury people who invented the story and changed it halfway through when I was halfway through the book. But the publishers kept it from me because they thought, because I was doing this at such a rate, which is unusual for me, I'm very slow. But when I saw it, I saw the first thing they showed me was just a tiny, tiny bit of a few seconds of their Mog rolling over, which was brilliant. It was so right. And when I saw the whole thing, it was a huge piece of luck that they should do this. I mean, they did it. You know, she goes backwards. When she moves backwards, it's so like a cat and like the drawings sufficiently. I thought it was marvelous. And I'd you know, all this. Well, I had to do the book in a great rush, but apart from that, everything was done by other people. No, it was terrific. I suppose I didn't really have much time to think about it, but I hoped it would be good, you know, but there it was, this marvelous. I think they're the same people as did Paddington, who made it. I forget what they're called. They're absolutely dazzling, I thought. Huge piece of luck, just that they should want to do this. And yeah, it was lucky, very good.
Judith, thank you so, so much for coming. I've enjoyed it tremendously, as I'm sure has everybody else. So if we
Oh,
please
thank
have a round
you.
of applause.
Thank you very much.